Good afternoon and welcome to Cosmopolitan Pilgrim. In this series, we try to curate knowledge from Samaj, Sarkar and Bazar. Cosmopolitan Pilgrim is a social content platform with educational and consultancy services. Today, we have with us a very special guest, Professor Sugata Marjit. Professor Sugata Marjit is the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Calcutta and currently the first distinguished professor at Indian Institute of Foreign Trade and Project Director of Center for Training and Research in Public Finance and Policy. He is a PhD at the University of Rochester and currently the editor of South Asian Journal of Macroeconomics and Public Finance. He used to be the director of Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta from March 2007 to March 2012 and Reserve Bank of India Chair Professor of Industrial Economics at CSSC till September 2019. Thank you, sir, and welcome to Cosmopolitan Pilgrim.
Thank you.
Sir, today's topic is pandemic and the curious case of inequitable distribution of vaccine and resources. Sir, my first question to you is three features stand out in this second wave of COVID-19. First, the blatant vaccine grab by rich countries. Second, the protection of patent rights by governments in developed countries preventing wider production of vaccines. And third, the use of vaccine distribution to promote both nationalism and diplomatic soft power. Sir, how do you reflect?
I think that all these three issues that you have raised are significant to the extent that this has affected the availability of vaccines, the punctuality of getting those vaccines actually, implemented, and also because the large developing world has not been the place to carry out the research on vaccines. The problem is that the first problem that you have raised in the context of the rich countries cornering the availability of vaccines, you see, in a way, it's a very natural process because whatever we say in terms of our motivation and our desire to be a globally benevolent entity, we often tend to be quite nationalistic in terms of availability of resources which are scarce in the world. So it is not really surprising that, like in many other occasions, the richer section of the world, particularly, by richer section, we mean that those who are also running the race of finding out vaccines and implementing them, like the United Kingdom or United States, these companies, these multinationals, and the governments of these countries, they have naturally tried to corner the availability of vaccines or get them first to the people of these countries for obvious reasons, for political reasons also. And then what happened though is that the economics of it suggested that the companies which are producing these vaccines, ultimately they're producing to make money. Therefore, they would like their markets to be expanded. This is the reason. And of course, there was a call for availability of vaccines everywhere in the world. So they went for, like the example being that this company in India, that, they got contract from AstraZeneca and they started, sort of producing in large scale to be distributed all across the world. So much so that we were exporting a large chunk of vaccines to the rest of the world because we are producing them. And any company would like a market like India, a market like Africa, a market like Latin America. So eventually, you cannot keep those vaccines, being you cannot keep them, get them used only in the developed part of the world. So the problem, there was an inherent conflict. The conflict is one of that, cornering the vaccines, but at the same time, you have to look after the profitability of your own corporations. So all of this taken together, that led to this kind of cornering, and at the same time led to some sort of dissemination by allowing a country like India, because India has a lot of companies which can actually produce. They are capable of producing generic drugs, but they are also capable of producing on a large scale basis, and that exactly that what has happened. The other two issues that you have raised, I think the problem still remains in the sense that we have this dilemma of actually, we did not know really how to handle the situation if the situation is not so symmetric across the world. In fact, India was affected to a general extent in the first wave. And everybody thought that the vaccine, because they were being produced in India, we should be available to us. But we see this, we have seen the bad things happening to us from all corners, from all sides, because not only the government, the central government has failed miserably in terms of making people aware of this big tsunami that was coming to us. They started cracking jokes about the tsunami, which ultimately has landed on the shore of India. But also the fact, you see this this vaccine maker, the vaccine producer, they said that they are being hassled and they are being harassed so much that they left the country and went to England. The point is that even if we took the responsibility or we took the burden of producing the vaccines and exporting to the rest of the world, we were ourselves not careful that, and actually the demand for vaccines and the requirement, that is how quickly these vaccines have to be implemented, how quickly our population, and to what extent the chunk of the huge size of the population that needs to be vaccinated as quickly as possible. We really did not take that very seriously, and that led to somehow this peculiar situation that the country which is supposed to export these vaccines, it may not have innovated the vaccines, but they were given the responsibility of exporting the vaccines. That country today, is suffering from the shortage of vaccines, and all kinds of excuses, reasons, and things that are surfacing. This is a policy failure, number one. Number two, policy failure, I would blame it, in fact, very importantly, also the company which was producing that, I don't think they had this idea, or they were also trying to push the government, because to them, I think, this is my version, and I stand to be excused if I'm wrong, but companies or corporations which actually supply vaccines do not want their supplies to meet demand, because scarcity breeds profit. This is a general principle of economics. Scarcity breeds profit through increase in prices. Now, true that in this case the government was trying to control the prices and so on, but you see, once the scarcity comes up, see what has happened. Now the central government is saying state government has to procure, or you can procure it from the private sources and so on. So basically there is a very peculiar, sort of intertwining of policy with political economy of this vaccine production and marketing. And the last point that I would try to make is that given the fact that India is going to, it's not really that the government of India was the only person who did not understand what was going on in India, but it is like, if you look at all the developed countries, the rich countries and so on, where you see most of the experts are coming from that part of the world. When they talk about, the vaccines, the strains, the future, the evolution of how do we treat COVID, and so on. All these experts are coming from big public health schools and all kinds of places in the developed countries and the rich countries. But you see, there was not much discussion in that country in terms of if something happens in India, how they are going to help us. And that's why, USA has delayed in responding. Now the larger world community has delayed in responding to Indian. It's of course it's our problem, but that is also a kind of, I think, diplomatic failure. I would say that it's a failure of foreign policy, because they don't understand that if this large country is affected to such a huge extent, then eventually, that is going to affect the world economy as well. So the question is that that this is again a dilemma we have seen, not in the context of pandemic, but in the context of policies pursued by the rich countries, because they don't internalize the fact that if you want to restrict the economic activities, the profitable ventures in the countries, in the third world countries, eventually there is a feedback effect, and that's not very good for the global economy as such. So we are just learning every day. We do not know what lies ahead for us. But yes, all these questions that you have said and are very critical. We are still hoping, but this is a clear case of policy failure, clear case of diplomatic failure, clear case of business and politics joining hands again, and only the poor people, helpless people in all these places in our country had to die because of these failures and so on. Yes.
Sir, you talked about the natural instinct of human beings and economics in general is to profit from scarcity, to increase the profit. Sir, regarding this, scientific patents are usually seen as providing a necessary financial reward for invention or innovation, without which they claim that technological change would either not occur or it would be more limited. So big pharma companies argues that developing new drugs require such incentives, such financial incentives, because the costs are very high and drugs may not succeed even after years of effort. So, sir, do you think that during this time, during during the time when there is a pandemic of this nature, there should be reconsideration of such monopoly of patents?
You see, as you have rightly said, that there is a logic behind patents, because of these arguments that the pharmaceutical companies give. One can find out loopholes in that argument also. For example, that a large part of the research that leads to the success of these trials and the medicines and so on, a large part of the research is dependent on certain other fundamental and basic researches, which are actually conducted in public labs, in public institutions, in universities and so on. So a research does not start from a scratch. In many cases, there are many such information. There are variety of innovations that have taken place earlier, which were not patented and which were publicly provided. But in these discussions, that kind of thing is missing. That what about those that you are also free riding on the knowledge of the society? So that is one. Number two is that the costs are often private knowledge. We do not know that what was the exact amount of risk and how much financial risk was involved. It all depends on the reporting of these risks and reporting of these amounts and the financial involvement. So these costs are not publicly determined, it's privately determined. Okay, so we do not know that what is really your cost. And the thing is that therefore we do not know really that even if yes, this product might have been very, very risky, and you are trying to break through this, but it is possible that you are making a very a little variation, a very fine variation of this of a product, and then you are claiming a huge amount of innovative value addition, and therefore a lot of profits, because and with the high price of the new medicine. In fact, it has been shown by very significant amount of research that multinational companies, at the when they near the date of their end of the, basically the patent period is about to finish, that kind of a time, when they near about that kind of a time, what they do, they start abusing their own medicine, because the own medicines which are old, if they do not do that, they do not create the ground for introducing the new medicine, because then they will start talking about side effects that they have seen and things like that. And also because when the patent period is about to be over, their competitors are going to produce generic versions of that old medicine and be competitive. So they want to crush competition there by actually abusing their old medicine. There has been research on this also, both empirical research and theoretical research, which shows that why would you like to speak badly about your own product? Because you need your new product to come and in the market, because the people would say that this is the same old thing, it's not much and so on. But then you say that, okay, we have now advanced, or we have now fine-tuned our product in a much better way and so on, because my old product, we found out later that these products were bad. So patents has their own problems, because the MNCs, I don't consider MNCs to be benevolent, entities, and I don't blame them all that much, because I think that, I don't blame in the sense, I do blame the governments, but I do not blame the MNCs, because they are there to make money. We have to regulate them. We have to see that they cannot harm social welfare to a very large extent. They cannot destroy the lives of human beings. But they are careless, and they care only for their success as a business corporation. So patent is an issue. Is an issue. But if you consider the current pandemic is really an eye opener. But you see, this is anybody who wins the race makes a lot of money, pandemic or no pandemic, so they cannot change the rules and laws just for the pandemic. But I'll give you one example where they did it regarding the pricing of the product, because you see, the vaccines are not so much priced in the poorer countries, because there is a lot of subsidy going on. But direct import from a private source would have been much costlier. Okay, there was evidence in the context of HIV medicine in Africa, that when there were Indian generic products being sold in Africa as substitutes of the patented medicines on HIV, the corporations filed a case against these companies, the countries which were kind of violating the patents. It was hard fought. It was hard by the court and fought very intensely in the court. Then the court actually decreed something which is very interesting. It said that it is the right to leave, and people cannot pay for your product. Then actually, that anybody can produce a substitute product, which may be a generic substitute for your good, and can sell to the people so that the people would survive. You cannot, the human lives are the first priorities. So the multinationals were defeated in the court of law. So there was this case that you cannot implement patent forcibly and charge very high price if there are loss of lives on a massive scale. You cannot do that. So that still stands. So that's why, and there was this natural agreement that these vaccines would be given at a reasonable price, at a cheaper price compared to what they are charging in the developed countries, and that was accepted. But the problem comes is that when artificial scarcity is created, because artificial scarcity here is created. I don't believe that things are scarce. Artificial scarcity is created by not acting sufficiently in advance, number one, to pile up your stocks that you need. Number two, even to access imports, you have to plan well ahead of time to negotiate with the bilaterally and multilaterally with the countries which are producing this, innovating these vaccines, and there are different brands and so on. Third is there has to be coordinated effort in just examining and announcing that the vaccines produced by Russia or some other countries are good enough, and they can actually start importing those and using it freely also. There should not be any politics there. There should not be any politics, because AstraZeneca has been produced by UK and the rest of the major things are from US. So they are in the Europe is kind of behaving in a, there have been some side effects, unanticipated side effects of AstraZeneca's this kind of vaccine like Covishield or something. But the point is that you will see that Pfizer or Moderna, as if they have no side effects. They are, because those are US drugs. I mean, I do not know. Maybe they don't have any side effects. But when AstraZeneca is always being sort of stamped as that you should be careful and things like that. I don't say that they don't have side effects, but the point is that there is always this fuzzy area, this gray or the dark spot of which I have no idea. That is it because it's a vaccine which has come out in UK and the US companies are trying to do something there. Because it again involves a huge amount of market share. So those things are going on. We can't say that we are in a world where those things are not happening because of this pandemic and people are trying for help. That those things will be, the interesting part of market and capitalism is that yes, it can be very efficient. It can through competition, it can provide a lot of good things to people. But come what may, the basic rules of the game will prevail. So I am definite that I do not know whether they are the main cause of this kind of, sort of propaganda or publicity or whatever. Or, there have been something, there are certain serious issues, not only in the context of the vaccine that we had, but also there are serious issues in other vaccines as well. And it therefore one does not know. So all of this coexist with patents, with property rights, with rules and regulations to incentive to give MNCs the incentive to innovate and so on. So all of this coexist, and pandemic is no exception. I believe that they won't have a kind of, they can actually have a suspension of patent provisions for the time being. But if there are bilateral negotiations, you don't need that. And one thing I think we should always remember, that before blaming the rest of the world, we should look at the mirror. Like our annual budget for some programs turns out to be 60,000 crores and so on. Now, there have been postponement of many government programs because of the scarcity of resource revenue and so on. But at the same time, there are many programs which are going on, and providing free vaccines to people of India or at a very cheaper place and acquiring them as much as possible and trying to, these are I don't think these are infeasible tasks if you plan ahead. So if I point out to the rest of the world by looking at their patent issues, their diplomatic failures, the multinationals conspiracy, and so on and so forth, they will point back to us. They will say that what the hell your government has been doing. So yes, these things are all important, but all of these should have been internalized at least 3 to 4 months back, when the first wave was sort of reaching a moderate phase. The government should have thought about what the experts are saying from the top public health schools and WHO and big doctors, scientists, and so on. Everybody is talking about. If they look at the Spanish flu distribution, which is the only distribution we have in the from history, there was a first phase, there was a second phase, there was a third phase, there was a fourth phase, and so on. And the second phase had the highest peak in Spanish flu. So because as soon as you relax a little bit, then automatically, and you do not know what kind of strains the new COVID-19 will have. And so there was this anticipation or apprehension that things are going to go wrong. And yet we did not plan. Yet we did not actually warn the people that if you don't do certain things, then you are going to be dead. Coming it from the Prime Minister would have made a lot of difference, because as people may look up to him. So these things were not done. So I think that I am very unhappy and sad, because it is us we need to blame much more at the current phase. And hopefully they are waking up and can control something. West Bengal should not have had, West Bengal was not destined to have so many infections, at this stage. Like Orissa, some other places, it will naturally flow and things like that. But this election, look what these rallies have done. That is, in the closed door meeting, people are putting on masks. In the open rallies, the speakers are without mask. This is the same thing Donald Trump has done, because the Donald Trump, was not wearing masks, so people were not wearing masks. And rallies, this spread out election schedule, where you took 1.5 months to finish up elections. And it will be a matter of days, for 4 or 5 days with very strict vigil on rallies, you could have done wonders. But what we have achieved. So that's why my problem is that I don't want to look at the global aspects right now that much, because we have faltered. We have to admit that, and we have to do everything to make amends. That's what my point is. Okay.
Sir, when you said about you don't want to look into the global scenario right now, this brings me to my next question, that when 3 major vaccine options were developed, the rich countries almost scrambled to lay claim to those vaccine doses, confirming that wealthy countries and individuals would automatically monopolize early doses of any effective vaccine. And we have also seen as a result that by late February 2021, COVID-19 vaccinations were heavily concentrated in the developed world. Now, sir, do you think that these behaviors somehow negates the idea that globalization is supposed to benefit all? What do you think? What do you think about the concept of globalization right now in context of this vaccine grabbing?
But actually, globalization is a very, very loaded term, and has multidimensional implications. So I cannot blame, or I cannot sort of praise globalization unequivocally. I don't think that can be done. I mean, when it comes to the question of getting new technologies, when you getting inputs or capital goods or new technology or resources or several kind of markets, because of globalization, Indian software companies became so big. That's for us, just a simple answer. Without globalization, India would be nothing, because India doesn't have very good manufacturing sector. Without globalization, India's service sector would not have expanded to that extent. And India is a service sector driven growth country. So let's not talk about the overall, problems with globalization. And in the context of medicines, in the context of drugs and pharmaceuticals, this has been a very old story. There have been umpteen number of writings, books, volumes, research work, which have talked about, this huge bias, in terms of the provision of medicine, drugs, and accessories that are needed for sustaining human lives, including pollution and environment and so on. So this is a known story that the richer countries, because they have more resources, they would always try to corner the benefits of drugs and pharmaceuticals. And you see, the point is that it's interesting because the multinationals is a faceless business corporation. To them, this whole story was that if you want them to sell their product, they can sell their parents also. The point is selling and getting money is ultimate they have. This is the multinationals in a way, they are not really interested in pricing, $100 in let's say in US and $100 in India. If they find that in India, if they price $50 and then billions of people buy, then they will actually, millions of people buy, they will actually price that way. Whatever sells, how they can sell it. But the political economy of these drugs and pharmaceuticals and anti-globalization kind of attitude comes because of the governments, because of the political institutions. Then they get into some sort of unholy alliance with the multinational companies and so on, to make sure that their political interests, their vested interests, political interests are also very straightforward. So if US actually innovates a drug, then the people would start saying that no, you don't have to export it right now, first let us get it and then we'll export. That will have a political backlash to the local political power and so on. So that will happen, and that has happened. That is not really something that one can contradict or have a contrary view. But to take it as an example and blame globalization because of that, I am absolutely in disagreement with that. I think globalization has done wonders for this country. But you always have the globalization, if you really give that kind of a metaphor, the globalization is a horse without a saddle, without reins. It's a fantastic horse, but it's a horse of somebody who has the saddle and who can actually run that horse. So I have a globalization which is, and if you can guide the horse properly, you get all kinds of benefits. And there will be always tussle between the third world, second world, first world, whatever you call it. That's why we have WTO, the World Trade Organizations, which was highly undermined by Donald Trump. But now it is being revived because America also knows that if WTO as an institution is destroyed, then America also will not get much benefits from trade. So WTO has done good for many countries, for India as well. Of course, WTO is also partly dominated by the rich countries, but the rich countries cannot. They were defeated in many conflict resolving situations. So I don't blame globalization as a concept, because globalization was there to start with, and globalization will be there. That's the best way that people can mingle, people can trade, people can exchange, and people can get benefit about it. It is not really, Rabindranath Tagore wrote about crisis of civilizations and many, but when he comes to globalization, moner maje apon hote bahir bahire dara or something, moner maje bishwa loke pabi sara. There was an issue that he wanted to make Shantiniketan a global place. Globalization, the way economists have used it and appropriated that and vulgarized it, I don't like that. But the question is that there are traits of globalization which I think are very rewarding for a country like India. It has rewarded country, without globalization, India would not have received very sophisticated computers. And with that computers, India has really done brilliantly in the software export and software markets of the world. So I can't blame globalization. But so far as these multinational drug houses in the third world is concerned, and the governments of these rich countries are concerned, they are there all the time. They have been there all the time, actually, to make sure that they get the, the first bite, so to speak, and I don't think this is an exception.
So, do you think there has been a distance between the countries of global north and global south due to this pandemic, and because of this, there could be a post COVID world order?
What we have asked is a question that probably requires a much more extensive and deeper sort of persuasion. It would be very difficult to treat it as one question and then sort of try to answer that. I believe so, but the way I believe is grounded in my understanding of international trade and the type of production processes that we shall be leaning towards in the post-pandemic situation. It is now confirmed by several researchers that the industries which require frequent and intense human contacts, they have suffered big time everywhere in the world. Okay. Now, if this is the case, then these contact intensive industries, as they are called now, which have suffered tremendously in Europe, they have suffered significantly in United States, and this is obvious to people that if you look around, you see that where you have too much intense contacts of humans in a production process, those production processes just got snapped. And it is through the human contact that virus spreads. So that's why even the international travel, tourism, and so on, including those trades where human movement is also very essential, like fashion designs. The main problem that happened to start with in China, in the Wuhan province and Milan, there was a reason in Italy, because Italy was devastated to start with because of the fashion industry. The fashion industry's inputs, accessories come from China. And there is a lot of interaction. WTO now has a category of trade which has not only, sort of exchange of physical goods and services, but actual humans. They have to travel quite a bit to facilitate that trade. So these things are going to be affected, and therefore it would be much more less contact intensive projects that would be in demand. That's why these online classes, the online resolutions or solutions of problems. If that is the case, then it is going to hurt a major chunk of manufacturing that depends on human contacts. And these labor intensive, contact intensive industries are located mostly in the developing countries, where these industries, because labor is cheap. If labor is cheap, you have more labor intensive industries. The problem is that one push might be that the contact intensive industries would be located only in these countries, meaning that we would be exposed much more on the contact, on pandemic type of situations. In that case, it would be worse than where from they would be sent out. Those industries will not be invested in the developed countries, so they will be sent out from them. But more problematic is also, it's a hugely problematic, that there will be extensive sort of expansion of automated technologies, robots and other things, which are very inappropriate for countries like ours. It has already started. My friends have bought, robots to clean up their houses. Okay. And so this is going to happen. And that is also not good for a country which has a massive, unskilled labor force and so on. And like in Africa and South America, similarly. So there may be a new equilibrium that we will go towards. If that does not happen, the bad part of it is that we will be exposed to pandemic or this human contact. If it does happen, there will be more unemployment. So we are in a precarious situation. We have to see how these things balance out. It all depends on public policy. We need a much more educated, much more informed, much more aware public institutions to help us through the process. If we don't have that, it is not really that, that I always question myself, that I have found that there are brilliant administrators who did not have much of an administrative training in the ministries and so on. I have seen that there are people with a gifted endowment of administrative abilities. To name the person with whom I have worked very closely is the Honorable Chief Minister of the state. The question is that but there are very rare people who are very rare. That also is an outcome of the fact that she was 7-time parliamentarian, she was 3 times, railways minister and so on. And she has this remarkably, very quick decision making abilities in the right direction. So, but the question is that you need people who know stuff, who are informed, and who trust the people who are knowledgeable. I may not like to hear from this specialist from Harvard Public School, this guy, Dr. Jha, who was telling, right and left that India is going to suffer big time later. I may not like him because he is not saying that India will be on top. But you can't deny that he is actually a professor of public health school of Harvard University. So I should listen to him. There has been this interesting, this thing that Jawaharlal Nehru went to, when there was this huge Bengal riots and riots in India when the nation was divided, and they could not control riots. So he wanted to pick the brain of somebody, kind of unexpected someone, because India just got freedom. So he actually went to Lord Mountbatten to say that how you guys will stop it. People said that don't go to him because you just got freedom. You can't handle your stuff on your own. So there will be a bad political backlash. He said, no, because I don't know. Because we were busy agitating. We were busy in our freedom struggle. We were not in administration. So he went there with a very trusted lieutenant of his. And actually, that's very interesting story. Who is that trusted lieutenant? And that trusted lieutenant was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. These days we want to, we see or we hear that Nehru and Patel were at daggers drawn and saw each other. Both of them went to Mountbatten to find out what was, what is the best way to tackle this actually. This came out in a journalistic piece very recently actually by a very well-known journalist of this country. So the question is, we got to go there and ask their advice. That let me know what we can do. We can do a lot of things that they cannot. And I can enlist them. Huge number of things we can do. But we also cannot do many things that we cannot. And I think this is important. This is very important.
Sir, recently, Mamata Banerjee led a clarion call for universalization of vaccine for all. And even many leaders from the opposition even joined her. And Rahul Gandhi even said that we should implement basic income during the lockdown period so that the informal sector workers do not suffer. Sir, what do you think? Why are we still not having free vaccination for all right now?
See, the point is, frankly speaking, I do not know what is dictating the budget allocation, because free vaccines, there is nothing free. I mean, in the sense, you will be subsidizing vaccine because you will buy vaccines and then you will give it free to the people. So the government has to spend money. So the public finance of it, that is why the government cannot invest that amount as subsidies. As the chief minister has said that if you could have reduced little bit from your election campaign, costs of election campaign, maybe you could have given, of course, there would be there would be certain concerns like that, even if these budgets do not match, or, there, but people will talk about it, of course. And it is important now the government should seriously think. You see, universal vaccination is very important, because that reduces the probability of you getting affected by COVID fatally. Of course, COVID can affect you, but fatally, maybe that is the less of a chance. The problem is that once the government announces free vaccine, the first thing, government cannot provide vaccines, free or expensive or not free. So I think that to provide free vaccines to everybody, it is the budget that is involved, and the fact that you have stocks of vaccines, which you can't show that you have this regular flow of vaccines. Okay, so I think both of them are very, very important. And what the chief minister has said is actually the demand or of people in general, particularly those who cannot afford. So I think she is speaking out on behalf of the people. So that's there. So far as the universal basic income during lockdown is concerned, I think that I must say that I am not really very much in favor of universal basic income, because again of the budget situation. Because universal basic income means that there are certain provisions in the budget that the government can spend that money. Now, during pandemic, and when the government has lost a lot in terms of the revenues of taxes and so on, indirect taxes and so, and economic activities have suffered, the government has not been able to garner so much revenue. So this is not the time actually to talk about universal basic income. That is one point. You have to first look at the resources in your budget. That is important. I'm an economist. I cannot be an welfareist without looking at my finances. So I cannot make a comment there. But the problem of the informal sector is a little deeper, if you really understand, because informal sector has a big spectrum. So you see those who actually sell, let's say, guava on the streets of Calcutta. Now, or those who sell gupchup or fuchka in the streets of Calcutta, Mumbai, and other places. Or you can think of textile of laborers in sophisticated textile farms, but these textile farms often do not record, give the record to the government. So these are all unrecorded activities in some sense, and it's informal. So what, to me, it means that different categories of informal workers earn different amounts. There are informal workers who are earning a lot. There is no doubt. I, as an economist, I would be really surprised that they would need that kind of help. But there are people, who live from day to day, or who lose their business, or there is a significant chunk of informal sector people. So that there has to be a way of government to identify this and make sure that when lockdown actually happens, basic groceries, have a kind of a census of the informal workers. The government is not in a position to do that, but if they can do, for example, in urban metropolis of India, they want to make a survey of who are these informal workers, where are they staying, are they staying with their families, how I'm going to distribute some benefits to them. I think distributing, financial benefits, sometimes it's a very difficult proposition. But what the government can do is give free ration, for example. It can give the, if you are announcing lockdown for 2 weeks, then you can see the 2 weeks, what are the typical household food expenses for these guys? If they have kids, if they have their families and so on, if they're single and things like that. And that can be arranged. That can be arranged. That is not a problem at all. make sure that all of these people are actually abiding by the protocols, and nobody is actually going to crowd in the bus station and train station to go back home. That you have to make sure. You cannot allow that. You should, so the protocol has to be maintained in a very in a stricter sense of the term. In Hong Kong, if you don't wear a mask now, as my friend told me, you pay $1,000 as fine. Even the baby masks have been prepared. So babies in perambulators are given masks. The question is that you have to make people aware. I think what the Honorable Prime Minister should have done in their, let's say in December or in November or in December or January, he should have addressed the nation few times and actually himself pinpointed the protocols himself, that these things, if you don't do, then you are hit by this big thing, and you are, this would have had a remarkable impact, because he does have the ability to attract a lot of attention. Now, the point is, you can't say that you stay at home, but I think he could have an accompanied video in which he could have said that this is exactly how you should behave. Because nobody in India, people are pretty opinionated and they're very independent. So now they are believing PM to some extent. Maybe they were believing. I do not know what would happen next. But the question is that if our chief minister, addresses the nation or addresses the state and says that this will be done, or this must be done, we will not. There is an impact of that, because they are the faces of people. They are the faces that people look up to. So I think that all these things, are quite relevant. That we should have done it.
So now, shifting the focus from politics and multinational companies, we're coming back to the role of civil society. Sir, we have seen how student groups and the common Aam Janta actually came forward to answer the question of security and scarcity, be it food, oxygen supply, leads and everything. Sir, then how do you see the role of civil society in solving the curious case of inequitable distribution of resources?
I must say something that be it pandemic or be it anything, Indian society and economy wouldn't have survived if the civil society in the form of NGOs.
Sir, your voice.
Okay, it's breaking up. Okay. What I mean to say is that independent of whether we have pandemic, a crisis, or anything that is announced and discussed in the media or floats in the social media, independent of those, this country, its economy and society would not have survived if the civil society was not active 24/7. That is the NGOs, the small groups of people, the small student groups, NGOs of different, big NGOs, small NGOs, medium NGOs, the neighborhood watch groups.
Exactly, sir.
If these guys were not working 24/7 in all corners of this country, pandemic or no pandemic, crisis or no crisis, this country wouldn't have survived. So I have a disagreement in recognizing this particular current situation as a situation where we need the civil society more. We need civil society at every moment in this country, because the government or governments are only partially capable organizations and institutions that can look after this huge mass of people, their needs, their problems. if there were only governments in this country, the economy and society both would have gone down the drain. So first of all, we should salute those civil societies who not even who actually, in spite of not facing any pandemic, any kind of crisis, they keep on doing this just because they want to do good to the people. So that is number one point. Number two, yes, and people are waking up, and people are lining up, and NGOs are doing remarkably. Particularly, I hail the young students and young generation of different parts of the country who have come up with innovative solutions to these problems of locating oxygen cylinders, hospital beds, safe homes, giving sort of support to the needy families and so on. This is amazing. You hear it every day, and some of them are quite bright professionals. You have to also remember how bright professionals have come to politics. You may agree or not agree with what Mr. Kejriwal does all the time, but you can't deny the fact that Kejriwal is holding his fort in Delhi, and he has tried. This is the point. We never achieve 100% of success. We cannot say that we have changed India overnight, or we have made a difference in the lives of the people big time, but one step at a time. And in fact, I am amazed by my country. It is not that, maybe there are politicians who think that they have to actually, create an aura of total unanticipation kind of thing, or something like that. People would be amazed by what's going on. It's like that. But people don't look at those amazing things happening near their doorstep every day, every point of time, and it's being done by small tiny bit of NGOs, even single person efforts. Remarkable. We see them, the faces in our neighborhoods also. We see them that people are selling their cars to help people, getting some money, and then acquiring hospital oxygen cylinders to distribute. This is happening in India. So these are, yes, we should strengthen civil society. We should I am very strong civil society proponent. I believe that everyone should contribute regularly to small and tiny civil societies by their active help and support, financial or otherwise. In fact, the government should take initiative so that the government can actually make sure that there are programs floated by the government where they can bring in civil societies, very, not really high flying, sort of thunderstorm like programs. It's like, it has to be very mild programs, one step at a time. This
Really genuine
really
news.
and the government should have a provision that if you are, and look at the so-called religious organizations, Ramakrishna Mission, Bharat Sevashram Sangha. There are lots of community helps support systems from other religions as well as there. You can see that floods, drought, you name these occasions, disasters, they are there. So I think that yes, civil society should be pampered more now. This is the time, and take help from all sides, because India is a big country. More you take, more you give back. So the question is that we should give up false sense of pride, and probably to be little to try to make a pun is kind of by saying that India actually should give up pride and prejudice. This is what India should do now.
Okay, sir. Coming back to the civil societies and the organizations that we have in our cities, uh, COVID 19, especially the problem of migrant laborers in the city, somehow made us question the urban sustainability model of the cities. Sometimes lack of proper housing facilities, green space, unhealthy working and living conditions only made the marginal sections of the people more vulnerable. So it's almost like the center and periphery model were all visible in front of us when the lockdown came and the migration crisis was taking all over. Do you think the sustainability model has failed, or the urban cities are need to revisit their sustainability models?
Uh, I don't see any uniform sustainability model now in the urban areas. There have been sporadic attempts to make urban areas more sustainable. Some of them are with success, some of them are not with success. If you look at Bombay, for example, Mumbai, um, it has both problems and prospects. Yes, low cost housing is an answer, but the problem of property right is also very much a complex problem that you go to small, this how do you negotiate with the slum dwellers? Because the slum dwellers know they are living on a very precious piece of land. And then there is this whole question of how to convert the slums into better living places, but with some stakeholding from the slum dwellers also. So it is, slum dwellers are interested in selling this out at a very exorbitant price to whoever gives the highest price, rather than allowing the government to actually have a safer living places, more comfortable living places, but in which there will be some sort of joint ventures and so on. So how do you change the attitude of the people on both sides of the fence? The mafia dons would come and they will destroy these slums, or they will bribe them out, or do something in all these movies show us. And mind you, this is not only a problem in India, but in small towns of United States, you also have, when these big companies come and they want to buy up all the farmhouses and everything, and they want to set up, because all these ranches and so on are running losses. So you come and build up these huge shopping malls, and you won't even imagine how many short films are being sort of made every day in United States, with a very simple benign kind of approach, but you see the subtle problems that's there inside. So I think it's a responsibility of both sides of the fence. I am not an economist who always think that slum dwellers are in a disadvantageous position, because many slum dwellers are not. In Mumbai, if you go to the slums, you will find the most updated electronic gadgets in the houses of the slum dwellers. So it's not, but the economic dynamics is completely of a different nature. You have to decide whether you would allow the government to go for safe, low cost housing facilities, or you would wait till some big mafia comes and offers you a huge amount of money. Only then you will go away. So these are the two important issues that one has to look at. However, I think the core of the problem, you cannot find it. It would be completely a misspecified framework if you find the core of the urban sustainability problem in the urban area. Because as you have said, the migration is an issue. In India, still 70% of population are in the rural activities. 60% is in agriculture, and then 10% more, and only 30% roughly, I think, are in the non-rural kind of sector. So what has happened after so many years of independence? We could not lead to we could not move people to better places and so on. Now, even with 30%, 25% of people, then they are concentrated in maybe 10 cities in India. We even could not spread them out into smaller cities and smaller towns. A lot of it has to do with the way the public institutions function. Because it's very interesting if you look at I'm not saying that this is possibly the ultimate model of because I remember when in 2011 the Trinamool Congress came to power, there was a pre-election interview of Mamata Banerjee in the ABP Anando, in which some of us were allowed to ask her questions. And one particular issue that I was raising a point at that time, I remember because you've asked me this question, otherwise I would have forgotten. The idea, I said that, if you diversify the location of public offices all over West Bengal, then there will be more towns and cities that will develop. If everything is in the writers building area, then actually everybody would flock to Calcutta and the population density of Calcutta will go down the drain. So the question of actually, and she actually, and she's a very good politician, so she was all smiling and say that yes, we have to understand all these problems when you come to the office. But the interesting part, if you look at the Bengal initiative, which I think is still in its very infancy kind of a stage, but in Bengal you'll find that she has tried to basically decentralize as much as possible. It is not only decentralization of locational decentralization. So the North Bengal, everything that happens in North Bengal, all the public activities and public administration and related affairs, they should all sort of flock to Calcutta for this kind of thing. Now you have this kind of decentralization of location, the development authorities, the everything, the buildings, the offices. Now the initiative has been taken. The point is that, but if the development does not take place uniformly across a state, across districts, then these metropolitan cities would be suffering a lot. And unfortunately, I believe that the economic prosperity of district towns in West Bengal are not as good as, except Shiliguri or maybe, Bardhaman, Kolkata or maybe something like that. But Maharashtra has been able to successfully get more cities, more towns into, built more towns into cities, something like that. So it is the sustainability problem is not only a problem which is related to a specific urban area, but how many people you would allow to come in which places, where you would, want them to be, and spread them out. So there has to be spreading out of successful economic activities and decentralization process. I think that's very important. There is still a lot of hope because India is still yet to achieve a lot in this context.
Sir, academia has kept the show going on with online classes and virtual learning, but there has always been the case of digital divide and digital gender divide, which is basically due to the socio-economic status of the students. How to address this perverse social inequality in academics?
You see, this is I can't blame online for that because there is no other way. Because if you say that there is no other way, it can't be offline classes, it can be only online, then all the good and bad things of online, it's a package deal. So everything good or bad that is associated with the online process will be there. And I believe what you are saying is right. I truly believe, at least at the level of primary school and secondary or high schools, body language of teacher, the physical interaction between the teacher and the students, the way the teacher asks questions to the students and so on, the way these students answer, the way that there is a fellow feeling, there is an intimate relationship that develops between teachers and students. All of these are impossible with online thing because you are speaking to a wall. That's basically what it is happening. Only in the case of very small group of students at a higher, education level, like I teach a class of students at IIFT in a special paper. There are 8 students. I know names of everybody. I know this. I've taught these guys now for almost 2 years, and I can interact individually with 8 students. I can't interact individually with 50 students. So I believe that offline students is going to offline teaching is going to be very bad for this, so far as some sort of equality issue is concerned. Actually, that is where you don't have the online facilities. For example, if your network is not working properly, which is the case in many places, the students do not get that kind of a smooth transmission, and therefore they are handicapped. And all these things are going to add up. that lead to greater inequality, because your primary school training, your higher secondary school, your training in the higher secondary institution or in secondary institution, in primary institution, these are going to be rough and tough for the kids from the poorer regions and things like that. The governments must make sure that everybody has fantastic network connection. That is the necessary condition for these courses to be at least equivalent in some sense. Otherwise, it's a problem. But what can we do? We have to get rid of this pandemic or the bad effects of pandemic as soon as possible. That's the only way.
Sir, my last and final question to you, sir.
Yes.
Every member of this academia is going through a very tough time, both in terms of pandemic crisis and mental health situation. So, sir, what is your last message for the teachers and the students and every stakeholders of academics to how to keep sane?
You see, I am a part of that. So basically, I am trying very hard to keep myself in order. But I think that basically, try to be in touch with your comrades, your friends, your associates as much as possible through online system. See, if there are interactions like this through different kind of virtual platforms, people at least see faces, they can share their problems, they can talk it out. So get out of your, I know that, WhatsApp messages are there, but you can also video chat and so on. But the point is that take some time off, take some time and talk to your friends and relatives or whoever you like to talk to. Create an online group where you can chat. Try to get involved in terms of helping other people. That's the kind of, it begins at home. So basically, in this case, I know people who, the young students who tried to sort of communicate to people in a way that they could deliver groceries to old people's houses where they don't have any young relatives or anybody who can to support them. So social work, the way you want to, you can read, of course, but you can write a lot. You can form groups and you can discuss things. You can try to help others. But because the online system here is to stay. We at least, if you believe my words, we are not out of tsunami that easy. So basically, you have to figure out what you have to do. I think. Of course, the standard things that they're listening to music or reading books, these are some standard stuff. But like us, we would have a chat with our colleagues during the day when I'm in the institution. So we have formed a group where we have our meetings, we talk and we discuss, and in what problems each of us is facing, how we can do things better. So I think everybody should form a small group and talk to people. Don't be silent. This is a problem of mental health, because you have your own world, fine, but you become so confined into your own framework that you become silent. And mind you that WhatsApp messages are not really the ways to break up that silence. Silence is again talking to people, meeting people, helping them. So I think those things, as much as you can do. It's tough, but that's what you should do.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an enlightening session. The knowledge that we have gained today is surely going to increase our understanding of Samaj, Sarkar and Bazaar. Thank you again for coming to Cosmopolitan, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.